Hey guys, what's up? Thanks for coming back and watching and all that stuff. I really appreciate it. And this is going to be a Q&A video. So a couple of weeks ago on my community channel, on my community tab on my YouTube channel. So if you go to my YouTube page, across the top it's like videos and playlists and all that. One of those tabs or words you can click on says community. And if you click on that, it's a place where I can post photos, I can post polls, I can post questions for you guys, that sort of thing. And I post there, once every week or two, so I encourage you to check it out. It's just a way I'm interacting with you all and kind of doing some Q&A and stuff as I go. But one thing I posted there a couple of weeks ago was, hey, I want to do a Q&A video. This is kind of a popular format for a lot of YouTubers. I've never done one. I thought it'd be kind of fun. So I just said, hey, will you submit some questions to me? And, I got a fair amount of questions, all of which I cannot answer in this video, but I tried to answer all of them, or at least the ones that I knew I wasn't going to answer here. I tried to answer on the post there. So anyway, this is a Q&A video. It's just going to be me talking, and let's just go ahead and hop into it. So the first question I got was after the honeymoon period, and by the way, I'm not using the name of the person that posted it simply because I didn't ask them if they wanted their name used, and I prefer to protect your privacy in case you just don't want people to know that you're, I don't know. It felt like a violation in some way, so I don't want to name anybody. But anyway, thank you all for participating in that sort of thing. So let me go back to this first question. And these are not in any particular order. The first question is, after the honeymoon period, do you go back and change anything on a photo? Great question, and it depends. I don't do that by design. I don't specifically say, well, I like this, but I'm definitely going to come back and look at it later. I'll often edit a photo, I'll export it, and what I do is I have a little folder on my desktop for photos I'm going to put on my blog, and then if I want to put it on, actually the other way around, pretty much every photo I export goes on Flickr. I'll put my Flickr link down below. I'm really big into Flickr. I love it. I recommend, it's a great place to share photos and stuff, so I recommend you check it out if you haven't. But anyway, pretty much everything goes on Flickr, good, bad, and different. Like, it's just my photos. And then the ones I really like, I'll put on my blog. So sometimes I'll edit a photo and then I'll go to post it and I'll look at it and I'll think, God, what did I do? Why did I do that? And so I'll go back and re-edit it, although I might actually just post that photo and then post a re-edited one later. So I guess the answer is yes, but it's not like by design or in a particular fashion that I do that. It just, sometimes I do it, and sometimes, I'll create a photo and just love it and just leave it out there, and then I'll come across it in my library. It could be a year later, and I'll think, I'm going to take another crack at that thing and just see what I can come up with now, because my assumption is that over time my skills get better and that sort of thing, and so I'll do that too. So hope it helps. Okay, next question. After you bring bracketed shots into Aurora HDR, when and why does it make sense to shift over to Luminar to finish editing? So if I build an HDR, when and why do I bring it to Luminar? Good question. In the beginning with Aurora HDR, I did everything in Aurora HDR. As Luminar came on, and there's so many filters and things like that, especially around color changing, like color balance and filters like that in Luminar that you can't get in Aurora, that I find that I take just about every single HDR, just about, probably not everyone, but I mean like 90% plus of my HDRs, I'll build and do basic stuff in Aurora HDR, and then I'll take it to Luminar, simply because I like the power and the flexibility of all the additional filters and the tools in Luminar. Like there's an eraser brush and a clone and stamp, stuff like that you don't have in Aurora HDR. So pretty much all the time. And so the when and why, the when is nearly all the time, and the why is just because of the power of Luminar and the amount of filters. I can just do more stuff there than I can in Aurora HDR. But in reality, in terms of how often do I use either product, I take a lot of brackets, but I don't always edit those as HDRs. And so most of the time I'll just take a single exposure and just go to Luminar. So I use Luminar 98% of the time, and Aurora HDR a few percent of the time. Kind of how it works. Okay, any suggestions on how to keep the sky dark? And I'm reading this, so I can't remember these. I was thinking about getting like note cards and writing them down and then doing like Letterman in the old days and throw them when I'm done, but too much work. Okay, any suggestions on how to keep the sky dark when taking bracketed shots at night using Aurora HDR 2019? I like to take night shots of the full moon rising over the city. I usually bracket shots at -2, 0, +2, and I've tried -4, -2, 0, which is more like what I do, shooting to the left or darker. And the sky always comes out too light due to the bracketing. I've also tried adding negative compensation and it still comes out too light. Is there any way to keep the sky dark and still get details in the shadows of the buildings? The reason I'm using HDR is to keep details in both the bright moon and the darker city buildings. After processing in Aurora, then I finish the process in Luminar. Okay, so how to keep the sky dark. There's 3 different things I can think of in terms of making the sky dark, and this would apply whether it's in HDR or not. And I will agree with this comment. In Aurora HDR 2019 specifically, the base HDRs are a lot brighter than they were in 2018. Just an observation. Okay, 3 ideas. Number 1, HSL filter, hue, saturation, and luminance. Generally speaking, skies are kind of in the realm of blue. You could go into the blue and take the luminance down, just go negative, and that'll drop the blue. And if it's a lot of blue across the photo, then I would just custom mask that layer in Aurora HDR and mask it into the sky. That's one idea. The second one is to use an exposure decrease. That could be with the tone filter or exposure or whatever, and decrease the sky. Decrease it, and then again mask it into the sky. So both of those could involve masking. And the third idea also involves masking, and that is you can take the sky from one of the other exposures. Like I take 3 exposure brackets, like a dark, a medium, and a light. If they come out too bright, I could take the middle exposure and then add that as a new layer and mask that into the sky. So basically compositing or masking in the sky from one of the base exposures into the blended HDR to get a blended photo that looks more natural. So those are 3 different ideas. Hope they work and help. Okay, what are 3 things that Skylum could do to improve Luminar and make it a viable Lightroom alternative? Good question. So 3 things I think that are really important to get it to the next level and make it really stand out, because I think the filters and the capability there are already far ahead of Lightroom, which is why I do all these Luminar videos and use it so much. With Luminar 3, I know there's been some questions around stability of the platform, and I know that's getting addressed. So I'm not talking about those kind of things. I'm talking about 3 features, right? So the first one is a brush that's edge aware. So I've talked to Skylum about that before. I know other photographers have, but the brush needs to be edge aware or more intelligent so that you can do more complex masking jobs in Luminar. I think that would be huge, huge, huge. Number 2, and this is something I know is coming because it's on their published roadmap, but it's something I think is important, and that is creating virtual copies automatically, being able to do add keywords, things like that. So those are kind of the little things, but you've got all the EXIF data now on that info tab, but I would like on that info tab to have a place to add keywords, and I'd also like the virtual copy idea where I can just go to photo, duplicate, or whatever like I do in Lightroom, to where I create a virtual copy that allows you to make multiple edits to a photo an easy way, right? So that's number 2. And the third one is a print module. I think the print module in Lightroom is pretty well developed, pretty solid. Admittedly, I don't print a lot. Some of the questions were about printing and calibrating, all these kind of things. It's not really my bag. I don't do much of that, but I do think a print module would be a huge addition to Luminar in order to make it more competitive with Lightroom. So those are 3 things, like an edge-aware brush, the stuff like keywording and virtual copies. Those are kind of like, I think, must-haves, and a print module as well. So that's it. Okay, next question. Let's say you have a photo in the library that you want to edit. This actually ties into the last thing. You have a photo in the library you want to edit. This is in Luminar. However, you want more than one style, meaning you may end up with 3 edited versions. How would you go about doing this? Having the ability to save all 3 edited versions of the original. I ask because there's no save option. Even if you only do 1 edited version, how and where do you save it? So this goes back to virtual copies, right? It's not built into Luminar today. So I did create a video, and I'll put a link up here about sort of faking virtual copies. And what that means really is you go create an actual copy of the file in the folder. And because Luminar Library just mirrors your folder structure, that extra copy will show up, and then you'll basically have 2 copies of that photo, and then you can just edit them differently. So that's how I do that today. In the future, there will be virtual copies, I believe, and that'll be an easier thing to do. Okay, next question. As far as your photography process goes, how do you decide the way you're going to shoot a particular scene? Why do you choose a certain composition? you mostly just go over the EXIF data and then move on to editing. That is true. I'd love to know how and why you take certain shots. One reason I do more vlogs now, and more is kind of a relative term, I don't do a lot of them, but I'm starting to do more vlogs and I enjoy them, is because it allows you to sort of follow me in the creative process of capturing the photo. You already know a lot about how I do things in post because I create all these videos about it using Luminar or Aurora or a couple of Lightroom videos, more videos recently about Topaz Studio. So I share a lot of my behind the keyboard, if you will, behind the keyboard process, but sharing the behind the camera process is really more what the vlogs are about, and that's why I'm trying to do more of them. And I have a bunch I want to do, I just got to find the time to do them, but there's one coming soon. So how do I decide, what do I look for, how do I decide on composition? So, one thing, of course, is the rule of thirds. People talk about, and it's very old and simple, but it works, right? So if you've got the little grid lines, kind of the tic-tac-toe board turned on, I think that helps in setting up the composition. But what do I look for? I look for lines. I love, like in shooting cities, I love the shape and the, of a path or a street. Or I look for lines, it could be the curve of the street, or it could be the curve of buildings as they're going around a curve, if there's something like that. I look for light sources. So this could be at night. Where are the pools of light versus shadow, those kind of things. And, I want to include some of both in my photos because, well, number one, if there's no light, you're not taking photos. Pretty much, I guess starry night sky with a long exposure, whatever. But, so, I look for light or pockets of light. Details, if I find something that's really interesting that would be just kind of, I don't know, interesting, I guess is the best word. It's got a lot of detail to it. This could be like a grungy alley, which for me would include lines, because there's going to be lines, like maybe there's a ladder, like a fire escape ladder on the side of a building on a dead end or something, or maybe there's a fence and a building or something. Lines like that, but also just things like that to me look good, kind of grunged up with a lot of detail, like a lot of structure and detail enhancement. I look for those kind of scenes. And then, of course, the obvious one that I look for is color. I love color, and I accentuate that in my photos pretty much, in every photo. Unless it's a black and white, which is, 5% of the time for me. So I look for color. So I look for lines, I look for light, I look for details, I look for color. Those are kind of the big things. But I can't specifically answer that question simply because every photo is different and every scene is different. And so I'd have to have a specific photo talking about why I shot it the way I shot it or what I was looking for. And in fact, that gives me an idea. I might do some videos like that where I sort of deconstruct one of my photos. If that sounds like a good idea, let me know. I'm open to different ideas. So there's that. Okay, next question. Hello, Jim. What is your opinion of a variable ND filter versus individual ND filters? I'm getting into long exposure photography and would like your opinion and or techniques for this kind of photography. Okay, I love long exposures. That's something I've gotten in the last year and a half, 2 years, 2 years, I guess. Really, pretty much ever since I got a really good filter set, have I gotten into that. And I use the individual ND filters. And the reason why is years ago I used to shoot Olympus. And before I really was into filters, I bought a variable ND just because I was like, it was cheap. I mean, it was less than $100. It screwed onto the end of my lens, and a variable ND is just, it allows you to turn it to go from lighter, filter to darker filter. Excuse me. What I found was that I would get a lot of vignetting out of that, and sometimes, depending on where you got in the turning, sometimes you get this crazy like X. It would literally go straight across your photo, and that's clearly not good for taking photos. If you got like a dark X coming across your photos with like pockets of light around, it didn't even make sense. So could have been a cheap filter. I don't know. I never had another variable ND because I changed camera systems. I moved over to Sony, and then a couple of years ago, like I said, I got a multi-filter set where I've got a 1-stop, a 2-stop, a 3-stop, a 4-stop, and a 10-stop. And then I've got the filter holder system, and you slide in the piece of glass, and you can stack them and all that. More to carry, more expensive, more cumbersome. I think way better though, and I think the results are just well worth the hassle or perceived hassle of having to deal with all the extra parts. A 10-stop filter, which is something I've done. Goodness, I'm gonna need some water. 10-stop filter is something I've done in a number of videos. and you can get these really lovely long exposures, especially if you're shooting water. Even shooting cities, you can just blur out people that are passing by as long as they keep moving, and just have a beautifully empty scene in the city, even if it's not empty, or really beautiful flowing water. I love it. 10-stop ND filter is probably one of my favorite things to do, and I do prefer individual ND filters over the variable ND. Okay, next question. I was wondering if you could explain in the way you use photography the balance you use to choose whether you're going to use aperture, how you define depth of field, shutter, if subjects may move, or manual, and why. So, because they're all capitalized, I assume when this person said aperture, shutter, or manual, I assume they mean the shooting mode, and why. So, here's the deal. I'm pretty much positive this is a true statement. I'm just going to say it as if it's 100% true, and it's at least 99.9% true. I never have shot in shutter priority mode, like in my whole life. I don't think I've ever done that. I shoot in aperture mode 95% of the time, and maybe 93, I don't know. Let's call it 95. And the other 5 to 7% I shoot in manual. So here's why. When I first started photography, 10 years ago or something, I started out shooting HDR. And that was because I met Trey Ratcliffe at a work thing here in Austin when he used to live here. And I got to know him a little bit. And he started telling me what he did. And I saw his photos. I was like, oh my God, that's so cool. I got to do that. And so I had no idea what an f-stop was. I didn't know anything about anything with cameras. But what I did know is what he told me, which is, hey, I shoot HDRs in aperture mode. And that's because that allows the camera to figure out the number of seconds per exposure, which I don't want to figure out. And I was like, okay, sounds good. Like, I had no idea. So I put it in aperture mode, and I read a bunch of stuff. I think most people shoot HDRs in aperture mode, but I've just stayed in aperture mode. Even though I shoot a lot of brackets today, if I'm not shooting brackets, I'm still in aperture mode. And that allows me to, adjust the aperture, of course. I change the ISO, et cetera, but I'm not choosing the shutter speed. I'm not, I gotta be honest, I don't really care. I know a lot of people say, well, you should do 1/250th to get this, or if you're whatever. Cool, that's great. If it works for you, fine. I'm not interested, to be honest. I shoot in aperture mode. It works really well for me. And the only time I shoot in manual mode is when I'm doing long exposures, especially like with my 10-stop, where I might do 30 seconds. So I put it in manual mode and I'll put it on 30 seconds. Or sometimes I'll go into bulb mode, which on my camera is anything over 30 seconds. And then it just goes until you turn it off. So you put a timer on it, and with a little remote, you just click it on and click it off, whatever. So I shoot manual mode for long exposures. Other than that, literally everything. If I were to shoot portraits, which I really don't do, I would do aperture mode. HDR is always aperture mode. Street photography, aperture mode. Random walk around town, just take a shot of whatever, any lens, whatever, aperture mode. I'm all about aperture mode. It's what works for me. I recommend doing what works for you and seeing how you like it. So that's that one. Okay, someone asked about having their library in Luminar 3 as well as backup copies on an external hard drive. Have everything on an external drive for now, but I want 2 complete locations. And this was a component of another question from the same person where they were saying, I've got my photos in Luminar 3, my library is in Luminar 3, how do I get a copy somewhere else? And my answer was basically this, and that is that the library in Luminar is not really in Luminar 3. So Luminar 3, it just kind of mirrors, well, not kind of, it does, it mirrors the file structure from your drive. And so when you add a folder, it's displayed in Luminar 3. So in many ways, to me, the way I define it is Luminar 3 acts kind of like a browser. It's sitting on top of that file structure, and it allows you to move things in that file structure, but it's not, it doesn't contain the file structure. So I'm an old Aperture user, and well, I have no idea if anybody still has Aperture. I'm sure some do, but Photos for Apple Photos is another example of how this works. They actually have the folder structure obscured from view from the photographer. So when I had Aperture, it just sucks photos into the Aperture library, and there's one big Aperture.library file. I don't know what it was called, something like that. And in the old days, I thought, wow, that's really easy. That's great. I just got one file to keep track of. But the problem is you can't really see your photos. Now, I think there's workarounds. Back then, I didn't know about them. I was kind of new. This was many years ago. And I've been on Lightroom for, 6 or 7 years or so. I don't know, a number of years. But I like the folder structure that I can see and manage, and so that's why I didn't like that component of Aperture over time, and I don't like that about photos. But Luminar, it doesn't hide the folder structure from you. It just displays the folder structure that's on your drive. And so I have my originals on an external drive, and that's how I connect to my library. And then I have 2 other external drives that I just take that same folder and I just drag a copy of that folder. So I have like a top level folder for Luminar, just called Luminar Photos. And then underneath that, I have different subfolders that might be US travel, and then under US travel, I could have San Fran or New York or whatever, right? So that's how I do that, but I definitely keep everything on an external drive and then have mirrored copies on other external drives so that I can feel comfortable enough to sleep at night. So I don't know if I answered that person's question or if I fully understood exactly how it was asked. Hope it helps. Jim, can you do a video on adding watermarks to your photos? No, I can't. I mean, I can, but I'm not going to. And the simple reason is I don't like watermarks. They're distracting to me visually. Whenever I see a photo with a watermark, even the most gorgeous photo, my eye is drawn to the watermark. And I get it, like you're doing it to protect things. Totally, everybody's got a different opinion on this. It's like picking camera brands. I might say Sony's best. You might say Nikon's best. I might say no watermark is best. You might say watermark is best. It doesn't matter. To each his own and all that. I just don't like them. It's just a personal thing, so I'm not going to do a video about that. However, my friend Matt Seuss, he did a great video about it, and I'll put the link down below. I think I can put it up. I just don't know if I can put somebody else's video up here, but I'll try. But if not, I'll put a link down below. Matt's a great photographer, great instructor, and he did a video a couple of years ago, I think, about adding watermarks in Aurora HDR and Luminar and all that. He'll take care of it for you. So there we go. Okay, next question. I know from your videos that you generally shoot brackets. And I've kind of talked about this already, but this was a specific question. In many of your videos, however, you just use one of the bracketed shots for the video. This is true. Do you shoot brackets the majority of the time? Do you generally create an HDR image in Aurora or another program and then edit the image in Luminar, or do you generally just use one of the bracketed shots to edit the image? Good questions. Do I shoot brackets the majority of the time? I do. Most of the time, I shoot 3 exposure brackets. Do I generally create an HDR image in Aurora or another program and then edit in Luminar? If I create an HDR, I absolutely only do it in Aurora. I gave up Photomatics years ago. It's the first time I used Aurora HDR. I was like, all right, I'm done. Don't need Photomatics ever again. I think Aurora is so much further along than Photomatics ever will be, to be honest. So when I create HDRs, I definitely use Aurora. And I mentioned this already earlier in the video. I'll often do basic stuff in Aurora every now and then. Maybe 10% of the time, I'll do a full edit in Aurora HDR, but most of the time I'm going to drag that HDR that I built in Aurora and I'm going to take it over to Luminar simply because there's more filters and more tools and more capability. And especially when I'm doing HDR, I'm doing kind of creative stuff, especially with color shifts, and I can just do that more capably and easier and quicker in Luminar, plus there's more tools to get it done. So Luminar's is better in that regard, in my opinion. So if it's an HDR, I start in Aurora and then go to Luminar. Or Jim, this is the last part of the question, do you generally just use one of the bracketed shots to edit the image? Generally, that's what I do. I'll fire exposure, 3 exposure bracket. Usually I'm taking the middle exposure, sometimes the darker one, very rarely the brighter one, but usually one of those other 2, and I'll just pull it into Luminar. Because admittedly, I get most everything I need out of a single exposure these days. Between the power of the software and the sensor on my camera, which is a Sony full frame, I get an incredible dynamic range. I don't really need HDR a lot of the time. Sometimes I'll build an HDR simply because it's fun, and sometimes I like to amp things up. It's just old habits die hard, but I don't really need it a lot of the time. So hope that helps. Okay, next question. Experimenting with Luminar leads sometimes even with an ISO of 64 to some kind of noise in the photo. I'd find it very helpful if you could explain which filters have the most danger to create noise. It'd be also interesting to know more in detail the workflow in respect of avoiding noise. For example, denoise before sharpening or structure or other tips and tricks. Okay, so first thing first, yes, if you're amping up details and structure and things like that, you can create more perceived noise in the photo. It may not be actual true digital noise, but what you're doing is like if you're sharpening, if you're adding a lot of clarity or structure, it's cranking up detail around those pixels, which can exist in the sky, and in my opinion, they make the sky kind of ugly, so you need to denoise that. Or specifically, just use in Luminar, for example, a filter mask on those filters. So filters that come into play, I think, structure, clarity, anything around the details filters, right, with the low, medium, high settings. I think any of those have a risk of creating or amplifying noise in like a sky where you don't want to see noise. If you're like me, you want kind of a smooth sky, or water, like I always want smooth water. So structure, clarity, detail sliders. So what I do is, there's two things, right? The first thing I do is if I'm applying those things, I'll apply them selectively with a filter mask. So make the adjustment with the filter, grab the masking brush, the little paintbrush or whatever, and then paint it in just to the areas where you want that to show up. That way it's not being applied to other parts of the photo. That's the easiest way to handle it. The other way is to manage it with like the denoise filter. I also like to use the structure filter, but dragging it to the left, which is what I call negative structure. And that basically removes structure, and it goes the opposite way. It actually creates a softer, kind of dreamier kind of look, which is to me kind of like denoise, because denoise is basically smoothing over things and removing detail. So negative structure does the same thing, and then I just mask it in. So that's how I handle that, and those are the filters that I usually come across as being, most notably causing problems for noise. Okay, next question. Topaz Studios has just released the Topaz JPEG to RAW AI module. If you find yourself purchasing this at some point, a review of it would be nice. So those of you that aren't familiar, Topaz Labs is a company that makes Topaz Adjust, Topaz Impression, a lot of these things. They have another product called Topaz Studio, which is basically a front end to a lot of those products where the capabilities are built in. And I've done a couple of videos about Topaz Studio. And in fact, I created a playlist around Topaz Studio, which I'll put up here for you to check out. I've got more videos that I'm adding to that here as I go along. But one of the newer products is JPEG to RAW AI module. And what this does, you can't, just to be clear, take a JPEG and turn it into a RAW file. However, what this JPEG to RAW AI module does is it basically uses AI to expand the dynamic range of your JPEG photos to make them more RAW-like. So you're not going to get, it's better to shoot RAW, just to be clear. But if for some reason you don't have the RAWs anymore, or you weren't shooting RAW at the time because you were just getting started and everything was a JPEG or whatever, you can use this JPEG to RAW product to expand the dynamic range and allow you more editing flexibility in that file. Because as you've probably seen yourself, when you push the pixels pretty hard on a JPEG, you're going to start getting a lot of artifacts and things like that. JPEG to RAW expands the dynamic range and allows you more leniency to get away with that. Now, having said all that, I don't have the product and I haven't tried it. I've read about it, I get emails from them about it, and so I am going to check it out at some point, but I haven't done it yet. So keep checking back, check that link for my Topaz Studio, and it's really going to be Topaz Products, but I guess I call it a Topaz Studio Learning Center. But anyway, check it out. I will get to it at some point. I hear cool things about that product. I'll check it out at some point, and that's that. Okay, next question. I don't recall you doing a video on focus stacking, that is, composing or taking a shot and post-processing that. Is that because you don't focus stack, or you haven't gotten around to making a video about it? Good question, and I actually get questions a lot about focus stacking, and I haven't done a video because I don't ever focus stack. I think for certain things, including some landscapes and certainly for macro photography, focus stacking can come in really, really handy. If you're not familiar with focus stacking, I'll let you go look that up, but the short gym definition of that is you're tripod mounted, and what you're doing is you're picking different focal areas. So maybe it might take 3 photos, let's say a landscape, and you might take the first one is like a third of the way into the frame at a really tight aperture, so all that's in focus. And then move the focal point to like midway to the frame. Take another one with the same settings, really tight aperture, let's f22 or something. And then the third one, which might be the sky in the distance, take a focus there and take a really sharp photo. And then what you do is you blend the 3 together and you take the best focal components of each and build that into one photo that has like super hyper awesome focus throughout the entire range of the photo. I just don't ever do that. I think if you're printing these really large, that could be cool. Or if you're like a super high-end landscape photographer, and this is how you make your living, which is not how I make my living, then it could be helpful. Having said all that, I actually do want to try it. I just need to get off my duff and go do it. I also need to find some good landscapes. And living in Central Texas, I don't really have a lot of that. I mean, I got a couple of spots where I could go, but it's something I'll probably do in the future. I haven't looked up any good YouTube videos around that, but I'm certain they exist. There's a lot of great landscape photographers. Thomas Heaton, if you don't follow Thomas, he's an amazing landscape photographer. You might want to follow him. He probably has, I don't know, but he probably has one on focus stacking. If not, just look on YouTube. You'll find some good stuff. Okay, next question. Hey, Jim, what about getting my Lightroom profiles into Luminar 3? I assume by Lightroom profiles, maybe you mean like presets. And you can actually take Lightroom presets and convert them to LUTs and then import the LUTs into Luminar. I've never done that. My friend A.D. Wheeler, he did a great video about that. I'll either put it up there or down below. But that's about creating LUTs from your Lightroom presets, and then you can suck those LUTs into Luminar and have at it. I admit that I haven't done that, partly because I've actually never used, purchased, created, or any Lightroom presets. I don't have any. As big of a fan of presets as I am in Luminar, I've never had any or used any in Lightroom, so I never really even thought about it. But number two, it converts to LUTs. And my understanding is with LUTs, none of the color stuff, it's just the light and the shadow and the contrast that's coming through the LUT, I think. I'm not sure. And I'm big into color, so I think I would lose some of that. And then number three, the bigger thing is I don't really use LUTs that much in Luminar. I think it's a cool feature, and it certainly gives you some flexibility. And I've used them a few times, but it's not really my thing. I don't know. I prefer presets, which are now called looks, I guess, in Luminar. I just think they're better. Personal preference, it's just like Nikon versus Canon or Sony or whatever. Personal preference. But A.D. Wheeler's, he's a friend of mine, and it's a great video, lots of views, and you'll probably like that. So I'll include that link down below or up here if I can, and I hope it helps. Okay, and last question. Jim, this is somewhat personal, but is your main income from photography? The reason I ask is that the amount of traveling you do obviously takes time. A week here, a week there in the span of a year begins to add up. Even myself, being a teacher, I have the luxury of lots of vacation time, but this leads me to the next question, which prevents me from traveling the amount you seem to, which is expense. It costs a lot sometimes. If my wife and I go to Europe, we're into $2,000 plus, so we can't be doing that 5 to 6 times a year. To sum up, Jim, how do you manage the time and expense, and any tips? Great question, and actually I think I'm going to do a separate video about that. I spent 2.5, almost 3 years with photography as my main income. Today it's not. I went back to my corporate work in the technology business. I did that for many years, and then I took some time off and built my photography business and earned a living at it. But I went back to corporate work, and I think I'm going to do a separate video about that. So some of the travels that I've done is because I was working in photography full time and was able to travel because I had the freedom, because I didn't have to be at work. Some of that also is due to the fact that my previous job, I was in a global, like international business, if you will, and my job required me to travel. So I'd go overseas, mostly to Europe, which, hey, I was happy to go. I have to go there for work, and then when I had free time, I'd hit the streets and take photos. So I have 100,000 photos from Europe or something over the last 10 years. Also on vacations, my wife and daughter and I, when we've had free time and vacations, if we've had a week or more, we've often gone to Europe simply because we love Europe. I just find it endlessly fascinating. I'm a total Europhile. But yeah, it can get expensive. So some tips around that. Look for a reasonably priced accommodation, and maybe consider not being in the place you want to be, or don't look at hotels. We've rented apartments. We've rented like on HomeAway or Vacasa, those kind of websites. Airbnb is one. You can find accommodation that's less expensive, even in fairly expensive places. Because easily in London, you could be $250 a night for a decent hotel that's in the thick of things. And I've been over there before, and I've gotten things like near Waterloo train station in London for like less than $100 a night. It's not big, it's not fancy, but you know what it is? It's a roof over my head. It's got an ensuite bathroom, which I'm not going to go down the hall. It's not so prevalent in the UK anymore, but in the old days it was. But it's got everything I need, and hey, it's cheaper. So I do things like that. I also use Hotels.com sometimes, and one of the nice things about Hotels.com is they basically give you a 10% reward Your prices on there may or may not be as competitive as if you book directly with a hotel, but you can basically get a 10% reward. And how they do that is every 10 stays, you get a free stay. And that free night stay is based on the dollar value of what you spent for those previous 10 nights. So we've built up a number of free stays basically through hotels.com points. And the other thing is we use our credit cards with points quite a bit, right? So we'll make everyday charges on credit cards that builds up points, and those points you can apply to things like travel, and we've done that as well. So you have flexibility, and I'm not a travel hacker at all. In fact, Nomadic Matt, if you go to nomadicmatt.com, his website is full of these kind of tips. There's a lot of travel bloggers like him. I don't consider myself one of those. So there's a million kind of travel hacks if you want to look at ways to save money. And then there's the obvious things like pack your lunch, don't go out to Starbucks every day for a $5 cappuccino, things like that to save up money. So those are a few tips, may or may not be helpful. They're certainly not groundbreaking, but one of the things I do want to talk about is how I make money from photography, because I do make money at photography and I make a pretty good living, even though it's not my full-time job. I treat it like a full-time job. I put a lot of time and effort into it, and in return, I make a decent income. And so I'm going to do a different video. If you'd like to see that, let me know. I'd be curious what your thoughts are. Leave a comment down below. But I thought I would do a video about different ways I make money with photography. And because I'm now working in a corporate job, the dollars I make on my photography can be used for travel and equipment and things like that, as opposed to funding my day-to-day, like my house and my car, that sort of thing. So that's that. So that's it. That was about 15 questions. That was probably a fairly long video. I wanted to cover a lot of stuff. Some of it's just not easy to talk about quickly. I hope that this was helpful. I had a fun time doing it, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. So feel free to hit subscribe if you enjoy this kind of stuff. Hit that little bell, wherever it is, so that you'll be notified of new videos. Check out my community tab where I post photos and polls and questions, and like, comment, share, and we'll be back soon, or I'll be back soon. There is no we, it's just me. Me and my camera, how about that? We'll be back soon with more videos, more Luminar stuff, more Topaz stuff, and any other things you want to hear about, let me know down below, and we'll go from there, my friends. Thanks for following along in this Q&A. I had a good time. We'll do another one, maybe every 6 months or so we'll do something like this, and that's it. Thanks for watching. Have a super awesome day. Take care. See you soon, and adios.